Anger can be a scary emotion to feel because a lot of us have been hurt by that unchecked rage of others, or we've released that rage on people, and oftentimes we've turned it on ourselves. We say terrible things about someone or a situation in our minds. Like, think of that blind rage when you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth, and that can be really hurtful. But the truth is, when we don't especially we don't mean it, right? We're thinking it and we don't actually mean it. And so having a practice of regulating and allowing the body to process all of that, those unsavory words, maybe punching a pillow, hitting something, even if it's the air or the steering wheel, pushing the wall, and then regulating around it, re-regulating on the back end, it's so powerful because it's important to get all of that out of the body.
It's really important that we are able to express our anger because so many of us are taught to suppress anger, and over time we reflexively repress it. We don't even know that we're suppressing. I remember this one time a couple years back. I was out and we were going out to eat. I was super hungry. It had been a really high stress time and we had to go out with a group of people, and there was nothing there that I could eat as someone who's celiac. And there was this huge charge inside of my body, and I ended up getting in a big fight with my partner and escalating. And what I really remember popping out of my mouth was, "You don't protect me." And when that came out, I knew, oh, I'm in a fight response. And that was really different for me because I don't usually fight. And there was like a moment where I was like, oh, I'm proud. I'm in a fight response. But I could also see that reaction was disproportionate to the situation. And that underlying narrative of "you don't protect me" is so big in fight response, which we are going to explore today.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it because understanding the fight response has completely changed my life, or like really transformed it, because opposite to you, it's a very familiar response for me. And I used to look at it as a character flaw, as like a personality trait. It was really something that defined me. And I think that that would be validated by my mom and maybe even some of my friends. And it was something that honestly I was pretty ashamed of. It was something that I really felt like I had to hide or suppress, but in the doing of that, it turned against me. It really turned inward in the suppression, and suppressing it created emotional reactivity, and it was really a trigger. And that suppression, it doesn't make it go away. I think it actually kind of increases it, honestly. And to just bury it deeper is to put it in the tissues, to put it in the muscles, and to really keep it stored in the organs and the really valuable parts of the body. And it wasn't until I started understanding the fight response, my particular fight response, as a nervous system adaptation, something that is reflexive and automatic, just like you just gave in that example. It's automatic, it's beyond a conscious choice. And then I realized that anger is not my personality and it's not a character flaw. And it being a survival response is a form of protection. It's a form of self-protection and a bid for power in moments when my body didn't feel safe, didn't feel seen or heard. And this reframe really let me help go of the shame that would spiral after I would feel this response. I stopped seeing myself as too much or too reactive and started seeing a nervous system in a protective state, just doing its best to protect a younger version of me who didn't have a voice. And from this place, I can get curious. And that is a good place to be. I can build a practice to discharge the emotional charge instead of internalizing it or letting it explode outwardly. Anger is no longer something to fear. I honor it. It shows me where I don't feel safe, where boundaries have been crossed, or where grief or fear is hiding. And today we are starting down that path again of re-examining the F responses, how they shape our behavior and patterns, and how we can create consciousness in those responses. And we're not here to demonize the fight response. To do that would be to turn against myself and to shame myself and to self-abandon. We're here to understand it, to integrate it, to learn about it and see how does it show up and to explore it. What is the body really trying to say when this activation comes on so that we can finally stop living in this internal battle. So, welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I support people in bringing their nervous systems into peak somatic experiences so that you can embody the medicine and the wisdoms safely and then go on to work to transform your life from a very conscious place, creating lasting, sustainable change. And I'm also one of the educators at the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification.
And I'm your co host, Elizabeth Kristoff, founder of BrainBase.com, an online community where we use applied neurology and somatics to repattern stress response, create resilience and capacity in the nervous system, and achieve sustainable behavior change. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, an ICF accredited course for coaches, therapists, and practitioners to weave the nervous system and science-backed tools and a framework into all of the good work that you're doing. And I'm so excited today to begin revisiting the F responses, starting with fight.
Yeah, me too.
Make sure to hit subscribe so that you don't miss an episode, especially as we're going through this exploration of the 4Fs. Before we get into the science of fight, we want to start with how it actually shows up in real life, because for many of us, chronic fight doesn't look like throwing punches. It looks like maybe having a lot of control or reactivity or self-criticism, and it's a response that has become so familiar that maybe we don't even recognize it. As a nervous system in survival mode, it's there just running all of the time, preparing us to defend ourselves 24/7 to stay safe. So I used to think I was just passionate or driven, but really I was operating from that state of chronic fight. I was pushing through burnout. I was reacting harshly internally a lot of the time to feedback, over preparing for every meeting, every event, and my system was running on constant adrenaline. I was trying to stay ahead of imagined danger. It also led for defensiveness to become very reflexive, not a decision, right? And I see this in clients all of the time. Like, you might snap at a partner for interrupting you, not because of what they said, kind of like in the story I was just telling, but because your system is already braced. It's expecting to be disrespected. It's expecting not to be protected. And that bracing is the fight response, playing out in that same old pattern. And then there's also the inner critic, right? That form of internalized fight. When you don't feel safe confronting the outside world, that survival energy turns inward. And the voice is there always saying, "You're too much. Why can't you get it right?" That is a fight response playing out in our mind against ourselves.
Yeah, there are many ways these patterns can play out. Think of the external critic as a fight response projected outward. When your nervous system is stuck in defense mode, even neutral situations can feel like personal attacks. You might find yourself blaming your team, nitpicking your partner, or assuming others are incompetent. Not because you're mean or judgmental, but because your brain is scanning for threat and trying to offload that tension by controlling what's outside of you. Fight doesn't always look explosive. It can look like hyper control. I remember a season in my life when I felt like everything was a threat. Emails, phone calls, mail, feedback, even minor changes to a schedule. I see it in clients that micromanage every detail because the nervous system believes control is the only way to feel safe. One client, a client of mine, a nurse in the trauma ER, held it together flawlessly at work, but at home, she became rigid and controlling. Her body didn't understand and didn't know that the danger had passed. She'd snap if the dishwasher wasn't loaded right, and it wasn't because she was petty, it was because her brain was still predicting chaos. All of these are examples of how our nervous system state shapes what we perceive and how we act.
So let's talk a little bit about how these things get patterned in, because these patterns are reflections of frequently occurring reactions in our nervous system and in our brain that are really changing how we see the world and how we respond to it. We're going to backtrack a little bit to early development, where our nervous systems are getting shaped not just by what happens to us, though that is the case sometimes, but also by what doesn't happen, like the absence of protection connection or attunement or no space with our caregivers to repair if there is a rupture. And when there's a child growing up in that environment, when a caregiver is unpredictable or explosive or emotionally unavailable, then that child's nervous system learns to stay mobilized. It's always anticipating threat. The filters that we see the world through start to change. And if we're witnessing anger or control as the primary tools for safety or to maintain some sense of power or control of our environment, and that's what's modeled by our caregivers who use fight as their own defense mechanism, then as a child, we internalize that as the strategy to survive, as the normal. And we want to remember that chronic fight is conditioned. It's an motor pathway, it's an emotional pattern. The brain learns early that mobilizing against threat is the most effective way to stay safe when we need protection or when we don't have that protection available, and also when we don't have co-regulation available. And so the nervous system starts to encode fight as the default survival protection. So it's really wiring the circuits that then get repeatedly triggered and activate our nervous system into sympathetic activation when there's stress or conflict, or we sense internally dysregulation, even if it's not a threatening situation now.
hmm If you're an entrepreneur or high performer who's been resonating with our conversations about the nervous system and burnout, I want to tell you about a free workshop from Brainbase called The Capacity Gap. It's led by Elizabeth and Margie Feltund. Margie is a successful multi-seven-figure business owner who's been through the cycle of stress and burnout herself. She now co-leads Brainbase, teaching people how to expand their capacity for aligned growth without sacrificing their health or relationships. In this workshop, they'll show you where hidden nervous system patterns might be driving stress and self-sabotage, and share practical, neuroscience-backed tools you can use immediately. It's happening August 28th, free with a replay available. You can register at rewirecapacity.com. Join us to shift how you work, lead, and live.
And because the brain values efficiency, it keeps selecting the flight pathway unless it's interrupted. And we start to make a change in that through neuroplasticity. And we also resource our nervous system better with different alternatives. We teach the system that it's safe to respond differently. When I first started understanding my fight response, I always associated it to early childhood sexual trauma, which makes sense, right? But then I started learning about relational patterns, emotional neglect, parentification, and even the stifling of my authenticity. And then more light bulbs went off, and I could really feel it arise in my system in many different situations of the aforementioned. And in homes where boundaries aren't respected, where children have to defend themselves emotionally or physically, fight becomes a well-worn path, a way to exert control in an uncontrollable world. It can also develop when a child's anger is punished or shamed, or at a time when no one protects us from harm from the outside world, or maybe it's not even known or seen that that harm is going on. Without co-regulation or repair, the nervous system wires in self-protection through activation, learning that pushing back, lashing out, or staying at high alert is the only way to make sense or to feel a sense of power or safety. And so when it comes to parentification, I think this is a really important place to talk about a fight response, because parentification is a form of an invisible childhood trauma where the roles of the parent and the child are reversed emotionally, physically, or both. Instead of receiving care and support, the child becomes responsible for managing the parent's needs, emotions, and even sometimes the household. So, this premature responsibility places overwhelming stress on a nervous system that is still in development. The child's own emotional, physical, and relational needs go unmet, not because they aren't real, but because there's no space, no safety for them to be expressed. Over time, this leads to chronic patterns of emotional repression, perfectionism, shame, and difficulty trusting and resting.
And so parentification isn't just about what the child had to do, it's also about what they never got to receive. Over time, these repeated experiences can condition the brain to default to a fight, especially when stress, vulnerability, or conflict arises. What starts as an adaptive response becomes an identity. Until we recognize it as a survival pattern, not a personality trait. This response isn't a personality flaw, it's a functional adaptation to environments where connection, repair, or vulnerability weren't safe options. It's also a time when our authenticity gets shut down through an emotional experience. That doesn't feel good. It feels bad to hide who we are and to not have our authenticity felt or seen, and that anger gets bottled up as an energy, and it begins to impact the internal stress state.
And as we know, nervous system and brain health is relational. There's a huge relational component to if we have a healthy, well-functioning brain and nervous system. With that frequently occurring fight response, we lean in our relationships toward protection over connection, right? It's safer to protect ourselves. So chronic fight is activating a threat-based filter so that even things like neutral facial expressions or minor feedback can be perceived as confrontation, and that creates a defensiveness that then erodes the trust and connection in our relationships. Our brain is predicting connection isn't safe. I have to stay in control to survive. And that prediction leads to protective behaviors like micromanaging, interrupting, reacting with intensity, which then pushes other people away and then reinforces that belief that people aren't safe. And that creates a feedback loop in the nervous system. Each relational rupture is then confirming that original threat pattern and deepening the neural pathways of the fight response, making it harder then for us to downregulate in social contexts like work or partnerships or with our team dynamics. So this can really play on itself over time unless we start to work with it.
I really feel that so deeply. Honestly, it makes me emotional because that was my lived experience of having a chronic fight response and wanting to be really close to people. And then because of the emotional reactivity and the eruptions, it would actually push people away. And then it was like,
It reinforces the belief.
it really did reinforce the belief
I'm
of
not
like,
protected.
I'm
I'm
not
not safe.
protected. I'm not safe, or people aren't safe. I can't trust people. I'm too much. My emotions are too much. And like, yeah, I just really feel it. Um, chronic fight, and this is also relevant for me. It can look like the need to like always be right,
Mm.
to over explain. Things escalate very, very quickly. And that creates cycles of conflict and also emotional dysregulation, disconnection in intimate relationships and in friendships. There can be a fear that letting your guard down means losing control. So we use intensity or argument to protect ourselves without realizing it's keeping others at arm's length. These patterns show up at work too: perfectionism, over responsibility, or reactive leadership. And because they often lead to burnout or rupture, they reinforce the belief that I can't trust people or I have to do this all by myself.
And because we need connection, but also protection, it can often play out as arguing as a way to seek that connection. Or we can be, again, misinterpreting that neutral feedback as threat. We can have conflict as a substitute for intimacy and vulnerability, right? Because we're seeking that, and that charge feels like that intimacy or vulnerability. And then that's bringing us into having power struggles as a replacement for our deeper emotional needs.
To make this very personal, I remember a time when like we were defining our roles in this podcast, and we have different strengths and weaknesses. And because I was comparing myself so much to what you were good at, I often felt lesser than, and it felt like I sometimes got combative on things because I didn't feel safe. Even in my strengths, I felt like I was meant to always keep up and always do the same thing that you
Mhm.
did.
Yeah.
And I'm not even supposed to do the same things as you did. And so I think it's a response that people close to me, I mean, we can feel each other's nervous systems.
Hmm.
So I think it is a response that people can feel. And I try to hold it back, but I know that you still feel it. And then I feel shame on the back end that you can feel it and we're not talking about it.
Totally. But that is the beautiful thing about having relationships with people who understand nervous system and know each other deeply is that was some really great opportunities to repattern, right?
Yeah.
To be able to have that charge. We talk through it. I get activated because I do feel the charge, and then my flight maybe kicks in, but
Yeah.
we
And
can have
I feel that.
you feel my flight, right? Like I pull back but we have the kind of relationship where we can understand that that's going on. We can take a breath, we can use our tools, we can use it as an opportunity to repattern and create safe relationship. And that's why cultivating some of these in life is so important so that you can give your body, your nervous system, your brain the good reps of being able to, where you would normally go into that reaction, have a new experience.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really I think all of the F responses are big. Some of them feel bigger than others,
Yeah.
like this one does.
Yeah. Before we dive deeper into this and continue going through the layers of our F responses, let's lay out a little bit of the neurology of an F response, because I think it's really helpful to understand, like we were just talking about, what's going on inside your brain and your body. And that allows you to see things with more altitude, to have more awareness, more compassion, and then, of course, to begin to understand how to repattern. So, the fight response specifically is a sympathetic activation of the nervous system. It's mobilizing us to confront perceived or real danger. And there's a couple key brain structures, and these are going to apply to all of the different F responses. So, the first thing we want to look at is the amygdala. That's like our threat detector. It's this small almond shaped structure deep in our brain that is how we detect and respond to threat. It processes the incoming sensory information, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we taste, how we're interpreting other people's posture and vocal tone, often before we're consciously aware of it. And then when the amygdala senses danger or emotional relevance in those signals, it's going to activate a survival response that can range across 7 different levels of intensity. So there's like subtle hypervigilance all the way to big anxiety, full on panic, or complete shutdown. And these 7 different layers of amygdala activation, different levels, they're not rigid. They're a spectrum, right? We're always kind of along that spectrum. I'm present and aware to I'm panicked and really activated. And so that arousal is escalating based on our perceived level of threat. And the triggers can be external, like a loud noise, or subtle, again, like facial expressions or vocal tone, changes in posture of another person that can trigger that amygdala reaction if they match a past pattern of threat. But they can also be internal, like responding to the signals from inside of your own body, like your racing heart or sensations in your gut, especially when those interoceptive signals have been coded as dangerous due to our past trauma, right? When we have those interpretations of our felt sense. And we see this because there's this well established communication between the insular cortex and the amygdala. And remember, the insular cortex is what's taking in and interpreting the signals from inside of our body. And so that connection plays a really critical role in emotion, in threat detection, and in the regulation of our autonomic nervous system. So the insula, particularly the anterior insula, is really involved in our brain's processing of our internal body states, heart rate, breath, gut sensation, temperature, and the insula is integrating all of these internal signals, and then it helps us generate an emotional experience. And so when our insula is detecting those internal sensations that the brain has learned to associate with danger, like a racing heart, that can signal the amygdala. And then that in turn activates a fear or a stress response, even in the absence of a threat. So that pathway allows for internal sensations to influence the amygdala's threat assessment, meaning that you could experience panic, fear, or shutdown purely based on internal body cues. And that is really relevant for trauma survivors and for the rest of this season when we're looking at the emotional experience, when there are these innocuous interoceptive signals that become misinterpreted as threats because of our past associations.
Then we have the hypothalamus, which works closely with the amygdala to coordinate the body's stress response. When the amygdala detects a potential threat based on a sensory or emotional interoceptive input, it signals the hypothalamus to take action. The hypothalamus acts like a command center, activating the autonomic nervous system to prepare the body's fight, flight, or freeze. It does this by sending signals to the pituitary gland and then the adrenal HPA axis to release stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. That increases heart rate, blood pressure, and alertness. The amygdala is the alarm system, while the hypothalamus is the switchboard that carries out the alarm instructions. Together, they form the fast automatic response system that keeps us alive. But when this pathway is overactive due to chronic stress or trauma, it can leave the body in a constant state of dysregulation within the HPA axis. The hypothalamus is part of the brain that turns emotions into physical sensations. And not only does it release hormones into the bloodstream via the HPA axis, it also upregulates the sympathetic nervous system directly through the brainstem to prepare us for action.
Another really important part of our threat responses is the periaqueductal gray. And people don't talk about this a lot, maybe because it's a mouthful. So we'll refer to it sometimes as the PAG. And this is a midbrain structure. It is located at the top of the brainstem, and it's connecting our higher order areas like our thalamus or our cortex with our survival based centers below. And it is located around the cerebral aqueduct. And so you can remember the name of it by peri. Peri means around. Aqueduct is the cerebral aqueduct. And gray, which is gray matter. It's cell bodies and not white matter. So it's this ring of gray matter that circles the cerebral aqueduct, and it's nestled in the center of the midbrain at the top of the brainstem. And it's tiny, but it's mighty. It's very important. So the PAG is really where we're deciding which F response we're going to go into, and then it's preparing the motor plan for our body for that. And the PAG becomes tuned by our lived experience, meaning that our body may default into shutdown or aggression or dissociation based on what ensured survival in the past, even though that is no longer serving us in the present. These patterns are learned behaviors, not in the moment, but they're pre-programmed motor responses that get activated reflexively based on our whole threat appraisal system. And that's where trauma and neuroplasticity really come in, because the circuitry that leads to PAG activation is highly shaped by experience. So if somebody is going through repeated or overwhelming trauma, the amygdala and PAG pathway becomes really sensitized, meaning that it's going to get activated by lower levels of threat or by internal interoceptive cues like our heart rate or our respiration that have become associated with danger. So the PAG learns through a process of associative learning. If a certain context or sensation preceded an event that was threatening in the past, it's going to more quickly then trigger a defensive response in the future, even in safe context.
Mhm. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. It regulates threat response. It is the checks and balances. If the amygdala picks up threat, it evaluates that, especially in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, where we hold cognitive beliefs, including our fear. An anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, is what registers conscious sense of our experience, perceives what we are going through and how intense it is, and it decides, as it compares against beliefs and past experiences, if something really is a threat. It inhibits threat response if it is not. And in a high threat or F response, the brain reallocates its resources to prioritize immediate survival. This means fuel, like oxygen and glucose, is redirected away from the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision making and conscious thought, and toward the brainstem and limbic structures. The prefrontal cortex is metabolically expensive and slow. Its It's responsible for things like reasoning, impulse control, and perspective taking. But when the nervous system detects a threat, based on prediction and past experience, blood flow increases to the brainstem, where motor reflexes are coordinated, and the PAG, amygdala, and hypothalamus prepare for fight, flight, or freeze. Without adequate fuel, if we are under resourced, the PFC loses its ability to inhibit the lower brain regions. So instead of overriding a reaction, we're driven by fast, automatic survival programs, often playing out emotional constructions from the past, not the reality of the present moment. This is why resourcing the nervous system is such an important foundation of neurosomatic training, and why metabolic issues can make us much more reactive, compounding stress if we don't help improve fuel and resources to the PFC.
So, just a recap on all of that, because I know that that was a lot to take in for the fight response specifically. So, the fight response is sympathetic. Our sympathetic nervous system is activated. And that means that in our brain, our amygdala activates. It detects threat, signals danger, and it initiates the fight response. And then our hypothalamus signals the HPA axis to release all of these stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that are going to prepare our body for action. And then the periaqueductal gray decides to activate motor patterns that are more aggressive, more mobilizing motor patterns. Our prefrontal cortex downregulates, so blood flow and glucose are restricted, and rational decision making and impulse control is lessened. And then our insular cortex activity there increases. So we start to have heightened interoceptive awareness, especially of anger associated body sensations like heat or muscle tension or increased heart rate. And then our brainstem starts to drive reflexive behaviors like clenching our fists or bracing or shouting that match those motor patterns.
And then let's talk about what's happening in the body. Your heart rate increases, preparing our bodies for physical exertion. Breath becomes rapid and shallow, so there's more oxygen for actually a quick action. Muscle tension spikes, particularly in shoulders, jaw, and hands, ready to strike or push. Our pupils dilate for a heightened visual focus on the perceived threat. Blood flow gets rerouted, moved away from the digestive system and toward limbs for physical action. Our voice may become louder or sharper, and that's driven by sympathetic nervous system arousal. Pain sensitivity, it decreases. Endorphins may rise to mask injury during conflict, which is a heightened inflammation response. The entire sequence happens rapidly and mostly outside of any conscious awareness, driven by predictive brain processes and past survival learning.
And these responses, they can be acute. And when they are acute, that is adaptive. They're meant to serve us in those moments. But the problem really occurs when they become chronic, right? When it's this well-worn neural and physiological path that's shifting our baseline way of existing in the world. And that chronic activation of the fight response is then driving our behavior all of the time and impacting our health with all of those changes that Jen was talking about in the body. So when this is a chronic response in our brain, that means our amygdala is going to stay hypervigilant. So we're constantly going to be scanning for threat, keeping our body then in a heightened state of reactivity, even in safe situations. Our prefrontal cortex is going to stay under-resourced. So that makes it harder then to regulate our impulses or access empathy or self-compassion, to reflect before reacting. And our brain begins to predict conflict even when there isn't any, so that we're constantly reinforcing this worldview that's combative or suspicious or defensive. And then our behaviors reflect all of that that's happening in our brain. So we become more controlling or irritable or reactive, prone to outbursts. And we're always misreading these neutral cues as threat. And our insular cortex amplifies, again, those interoceptive cues so that we're more reactive to our internal sensations as well, fueling more anger and frustration. And it can show up in all kinds of ways. Like we talked about, perfectionism, micromanaging, short temper. You can have a hard time collaborating, and vulnerability becomes really dangerous in this state.
It's really getting me, this conversation. It's just so personal. It's still hard to look at a past version of yourself as you know what I mean? Yeah. Okay, do I look like I've been crying?
No, you look good, and I honestly think it's okay.
All of this activation, it really impacts our body. It impacts our health. A chronic sympathetic nervous system activation, it keeps cortisol and adrenaline elevated, leading to inflammation, immune dysregulation, and hormonal imbalance. The cardiovascular system is overloaded. It's overtaxed. It links to a high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke risk. Muscle tension becomes chronic, especially in the jaw, the neck, and shoulders, often leading to chronic pain, TMJ, or tension headaches. Digestion slows or shuts down, contributes to IBS, bloating, or gut brain dysregulation, even dysbiosis. So, sleep is disrupted, keeping the system wired and tired, which worsens emotional reactivity and physical recovery. Ultimately, chronic fight isn't just a personality trait, it's a learned and biologically reinforced survival strategy. Sometimes we aren't aware that all of this is going on inside of us, but it is. And it's only when we face physical health outcomes that we are aware of this chronic dysregulation.
So, since this season is all about emotion, we want to look at how exactly our physical state, our internal state, shapes our emotions and our behaviors. So, we want to remember that the brain doesn't passively react, it's always predicting, and it's using past experience to anticipate what's happening in the body, our interoception, and the world outside of us, our exteroception. And then it's constructing an emotion to guide our action based on that past experience. So in chronic fight, our brain is repeatedly predicting threat and it's mobilizing us. And that becomes a dominant neural pathway, this well worn path that is going to keep us selecting anger, defensiveness, urgency as the emotional categories that our brain is constructing. And all of our interoceptive inputs, like the racing heart, the tight muscles, the heat that we feel, that inflammatory response really with the heat, which might otherwise signal exercise or excitement, they're starting to be interpreted as agitation or rage or frustration. The emotion is constructed from those signals, and how that's constructed is shaped by our past experience and our brain's prediction. And so our emotional experience becomes really biased toward that mobilizing action because our brain is expecting the need to act fast, to fight, to argue, to fix, to push. That really becomes the template for our behavior. Since emotions, we'll talk about this a lot this season's, are action motivators, right? They're preparing our body to meet a predicted need. So in chronic fight, is going to drive our behavior to meet a need like protection or defense. So that's going to drive that behavior towards confrontation, overworking, perfectionism, really controlling our internal or external environment, even in non threatening situations. And that lens is the lens through which our brain filters reality. And it becomes, is this a threat? Is this a threat I need to respond to? And the answer is often yes at that subconscious level. And then that can really hijack the situation. It can narrow our perspective and again reinforce those threat based loops.
And then we have the body's internal state. Our interoception is one of the primary signals the brain uses to decide, what am I feeling and what do I need to do about it? When the nervous system is chronically in a fight pattern, the internal signals are always high arousal, tight chest, shallow breath, increased heart rate. These sensations become the baseline, not the exception. Over time, those internal cues can start to feel like normal, but they're still sending the brain a message that something is wrong, something needs to be confronted or fixed. The brain constructs emotion from these sensations, so it keeps creating stories that match. I'm angry, I'm disrespected, I'm not safe unless I take control. That emotion then drives behavior, snapping at a partner, micromanaging a team, over preparing, pushing through exhaustion, because the body believes that's the only place for it to safely operate from. And because the nervous system is filtering the world through this survival lens, even neutral or supportive environments can be misread as unsafe, reinforcing the need to stay in defense. So, what we see and feel and do isn't just about the external world, it's a reflection of the internal state that we've been trained to expect, often from an early life or trauma history.
And since this season we're talking a lot about emotions, we wanted to pair these F responses with different emotions to examine. And so we're going to look at anger versus a chronic fight response because they're really two different signals in the same language. The pattern of conflict and disconnection in relationships are often fueled by a deeper confusion between these two different signals, right? We have anger and we have the chronic fight response. So before we can begin to shift our behaviors, we need to understand how anger, when it's acknowledged and processed, is a healthy emotion and it can guide us toward clarity and connection, while the chronic fight response keeps us stuck in cycles of reactivity and that constant protection and disconnection from others. So, anger is really a healthy, time bound emotion. It's a signal that a boundary has been crossed, or a need is not met, or there's an injustice present. And sometimes it overlaps with other emotions that are being suppressed by the anger, like grief or fear. But most of the time, we're looking at it as a healthy response to the boundary, the unmet need, or the injustice. And fight, on the other hand, is a physiological survival state. It's this ongoing reactive and unconscious response. So when anger is processed, it is responsive. Chronic fight, when it stays unprocessed, it's becoming reflexive and not um, a real reaction to the present moment. So your anger can actually help you identify what matters to you and help you start to act in alignment and stand up for your needs, while chronic fight loops just go on in the background, creating all of this controlling and bracing and reacting without conscious awareness.
And I think about the fake arguments,
Mhm.
the fake conversations, like things that never actually even come to pass.
That's such a signal to me that I'm stuck in a fight
Mhm,
response that
mhm.
hasn't been processed or mobilized when I'm replaying those fake arguments in
Yeah,
my mind.
yeah, just totally making things up with
Mhm.
strangers.
Yes.
Processing anger safely teaches our nervous system it's safe to feel this without needing to fight. I can take aligned action. Anger is a signal that I can move it and I can take action really where I need to. Suppressed anger leads to chronic tension, reactivity, and emotional shutdown. Anger can be a scary emotion to feel because a lot of us have been hurt by that unchecked rage of others, or we've released that rage on people, and oftentimes we've turned it on ourselves. We say terrible things about someone or a situation in our minds. Like, think of that blind rage when you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth. And that can be really hurtful. But the truth is, when we don't especially we don't mean it, right? We're thinking it and we don't actually mean it. And so having a practice of regulating and allowing the body to process all of that, those unsavory words, maybe punching a pillow, hitting something, even if it's the air or the steering wheel, pushing the wall, and then regulating around it, re-regulating on the back end, it's so powerful because it's important to get all of that out of the body. In a few of the practice that I just listed, including it really includes bracing the body with intention and then relaxing the body also intentionally so that you learn how to feel the bracing when it comes into your body. The more you release the brace, the more you can feel it come on, and then you can work with it from a higher awareness when you're working with your nervous system. When I think about the well of anger that lives in my body, right, that's very valid. It's like the threat bucket that we talk about. So when little things go into the well, go into the well, get into the well, eventually the well is going to overflow until there is that emotional reactivity. And so I think about my well of anger as a very valid well. And so I process as much as I can when things come on so that those little things don't get in there. And that Because if I don't, it's going to lead to other chronic outputs like shame or guilt, more protective responses.
When we allow ourselves to feel that anger and to process it, then we can take more aligned action, especially in our relationships, right? Like, think of maybe there's someone in an argument with their partner and they feel the heat rise in their chest. And instead of reacting, because they have a process of working with their anger, feeling those cues, knowing how to respond, they take a break and they regulate. They do some neuro tools or they process some of the anger. And then they can realize that the anger is tied to a deeper need for emotional safety. And can come back and share with their partner. When I feel dismissed, it brings up a lot of old stuff for me. Or and I need to know that we're still on the same team. They can express the anger from this place of presence rather than panic. When we're stuck in that chronic fight response without regulation, that same trigger can then lead to heightened conflict, yelling, defensiveness, withdrawal. You can storm out of the room or make accusations. And then again, like you were talking about, Jen, then it's followed by that guilt and shame. And so there's no resolution. There's just that cycle of rupture and then regret. It's really important that we are able to express our anger because so many of us are taught to suppress anger. And over time, we reflexively repress it. We don't even know that we're suppressing, right? So that anger doesn't just disappear, it then becomes that unresolved chronic activation in our nervous system, keeping the body in a low grade sympathetic state. Or if we go all the way into freeze, it might bring us into a shutdown state. So, from an interoceptive neuroscience lens, suppressing anger means that our brain predicts activation, but it inhibits the expression of that. And that's creating a mismatch between our internal arousal and then our external behavior out in the world, which then is going to keep us in a constant state of dysregulation and long term stress. So, emotions like anger, if they're constantly repressed, our brain stops constructing them as valid categories, right? This is called conceptual pruning when we stop having the emotional capacity to name and experience different emotions because of that chronic repression, and that's going to really reduce our emotional granularity. It makes it harder for us to recognize and name what we feel, and then we get stuck in those states of ongoing repression that leads to all of those physical outputs: cortisol in the body all of the time, inflammatory cytokines. Our immune system starts to lose some resilience. We are at increased risk for autoimmune disorders, digestive issues, different mental health conditions, anxiety and depression. That whole pattern of suppression or repression, it becomes automated through our neural pathways. So that is no longer a conscious choice either. It's a trained, embodied survival strategy that our brain and our body are defaulting to, even if they're not adaptive. Like, even if we know we want to process our anger, we might reflexively repress it. And that is because of predictive coding, right? It keeps our system forecasting it's not safe to express anger. And that starts to inhibit our action, even when the environment changes, unless we start to recondition that by new tools and practices.
Suppressing anger is often a learned survival strategy, especially in environments where expressing anger led to punishment, rejection, or danger. For women and marginalized identities, cultural and structural conditioning, patriarchy, racism, classism, it teaches that anger is unacceptable or dangerous, especially when directed at authority and injustice. That social conditioning becomes internalized, creating shame around anger and reinforcing the belief that if I feel this, I am bad. So we disconnect from that anger at a very young age, not because it wasn't there, but because it wasn't safe to feel it or express it. That disconnection shows up as chronic tension, burnout, autoimmune issues, digestive dysfunction, or even people pleasing patterns that mask a deeper frustration. The very thing that protected us, suppressing anger becomes the thing that harms us because the emotion stays in the body even when we don't consciously acknowledge it. Healing often starts by recognizing that suppression is not a weakness, it was adaptive. And now we get to slowly build the safety to feel and express what was once off limits.
So we want to start to be able to release anger and create regulated states inside of our body. And this is especially important with boundaries because anger is a high arousal signal from the nervous system that something matters. Anger itself isn't the problem, but if it's unprocessed, that charge behind it can distort our boundaries if we act too quickly. So we want to start to use our tools to regulate that charge and create space between the sensation and the action, right? This lets the prefrontal cortex come back online for clear decision making. And when we're talking about boundaries, their healthy boundaries are really rooted in regulation instead of reactivity, right? I can feel firm, but also safe. Um, and that comes from clarity, not a nervous system that's trying to offload threats. So when we build the skill of nervous system regulation, our brain can start to update these predictions and we can stop automatically expecting everyone to harm us when there isn't harm there, or we can assess where the appropriate harm is, right? Maybe it's societal, like Jen was talking about, and we can take aligned action. And we start to become able to distinguish between past threat and present day reality. And then we can respond with clarity instead of a conditioned defense. And we can also help our body by processing some of that anger that comes from these bigger systemic things like injustice.
Reclaiming anger means recognizing it as a clarifying force, not something to hide or suppress. It helps us get clear on what we value and what's not okay. When we process anger instead of performing politeness, we can communicate boundaries from presence, not panic, people pleasing, or collapse. Anger expressed with awareness becomes a tool for communication, not conflict. It teaches others how to be in right relationship with us, and it allows us to stay grounded in our own truth. As we learn to regulate, we not only stop overreacting to safe situations, we also get better at recognizing when anger is appropriate and necessary, like in response to social injustice or harmful relationships. And we can take aligned action from a grounded, powerful place. And then that's when our boundaries and our words, our truths are really truly received by another person.
So we don't need to get rid of our fight response. Again, this is a healthy, protective survival response. We need to give it a safer home inside of our body because it's not a flaw. It's a protective reflex. So it's important then to differentiate that chronic fight, a conditioned nervous system response from anger, the emotional signal with a purpose. And remember that fight is reflexive and survival based. Anger, when processed, is informative and action oriented. So anger is not an enemy, it's our compass. And if we're stuck in this chronic fight cycle, change is possible, right? We are neuroplastic beings. And when we can use tools, neurosomatic tools, somatic tools, emotional processing, we can start to shift that baseline from activation to regulation and teach our brain that safety doesn't always require control or defensiveness. And then we learn to regulate our nervous system more over time in little minimum effective dose of emotional processing. And we retrain the brain to stop predicting all of that harm and start constructing emotions that are accurate to the present moment, timely, useful for setting boundaries, making aligned choices, and really creating depth and safety in our connection with others.
Fight is not who you are. It's a protective pattern shaped by past experiences. Anger isn't bad or shameful. It's a natural part of being human, and reclaiming it is part of healing. When we work with the body, we learn to recognize the signals of fight, that jaw tension, the bracing, the speech, the urgency in our bodies versus the deeper messages of anger and we can choose to respond to that instead of reacting. You don't have to stay stuck in burnout, blow ups, or people pleasing. With NSI tools and nervous system support, you can process anger safely, express your truth, and build relationships that honor both your boundaries and your softness.
If you're ready to take some action to move out of this chronic fight response and start building real tools for nervous system regulation and emotional expression, join us inside Rewire Trial. At rewiretrial.com, you'll learn how to work with your body, not against it, to process emotions like anger, to set clear boundaries, and to feel safe being fully yourself and inside of yourself with your own body.
Subscribe to the podcast, share this message with someone in your life who needs it, and we'll see you at Rewire Trial to start your journey toward regulated embodied power.